Welcome. My name is Christina Bolin, and I'm a third-year student in the Global Leadership Program at NYU Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for tuning into today's webinar, The Future of Chocolate City. I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed panelists for today's discussion. Joining us is director and writer, Minyote Kabuta, whose documentary film, What Happened to Chocolate City, will screen next week. Joining us is also Dr. Willow Lung Amam, Associate Professor in Urban Studies and Planning and Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education at the University of Maryland. Joining us is also Dr. Andre Perry, Senior Fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And we also have Dr. Sabia Prince, urban anthropologist and artist. And finally, our moderator for the conversation, Jamal Holtz, project manager and assistant to the president at Link Strategic Partners, who I'm going to hand it off to begin the discussion. Thank you so much for joining us and enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Christina. Truly, I wish every introduction was as short and sweet as that. Sometimes it takes about 30 minutes to intro people, but this is all a discussion, and I'm excited to have this discussion with you all. I'm a native Washingtonian, so every point I get to say that, I'm going to say it, born and raised in Ward 8, Southeast. So excited to have this conversation about the future of Chocolate City. You have a distinguished group of panelists who seen Chocolate City in many different walks of life and facets, from research to lived experiences to really studying in on the future of Chocolate City. So excited to be leading this dialogue with so many famous people on this call. So at some point I'll get you all's autograph if we were in person. But I want to take a dive into this conversation, right, about the future of Chocolate City. DC, just to add a bit of a historic context, I think we should take people through the history and then jump into the today. DC was the largest slave trading city in the 19th centuries. It was places like Georgetown that was the hub for slave trade and for slave owners to trade enslaved people. You go into Georgetown today and literally see no signs of that history and don't really get that feel based on the historic context of what Georgetown was for. Even thinking about where DC was centered in the United States and why it was a hub for the slave trade, it was easy to bring enslaved people into those ports and trade them at that port of entry. But even when you move into the 20th centuries, DC was the hub for Black excellence, arts, and Black businesses. You head to places like U Street, which was known as Black Broadway. And fast forward to now, DC is a little under 48% Black. Let's unpack that history a bit more and talk about some of those nuances, because at one point where DC was predominantly white, but had a lot of enslaved people, but after emancipation, it became a hub for Black excellence, and now we're seeing a bit of a milk chocolate type of city. Andre, Dr. Perry, you study this data and demographic shift a lot. You know the shift in home ownership and the percentage of Black-owned businesses in DC. What stands out to you in the data over the years as you take a closer look at that?
First of all, thanks for having me. It's always good to have universities engage with the communities they're in. So I support this because too often universities, particularly in the DC region, has been distinctively distant from the local communities. And so it's encouraging we're having this conversation. But clearly, particularly over the last 20 years, we've seen almost a drop in population of about 20%, and that's commensurate with a drop in home ownership since 2000 in particular. And that is commensurate with businesses leaving the district as well, or declining as well. All of these things are interconnected. So without population, you're going to have less housing. With less housing, you're going to have less business, because most people finance their business using the equity in their home. But what's even more disturbing is the attempts to erase culture in the city that goes along with it. Someone who studies Black cities, I always say demographic shifts, just as Washington, D.C. has gone through several iterations of majority Black, majority white, and we recognize that history. But in each attempt, there's another attempt to erase Blackness from cities, and we will probably talk about the T-Mobile situation a little bit later. But the thing that stands out for me in short is the declining population in the district. But we need to be clear, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a declining population in the region. People are largely being pushed out to Prince George's County and in other surrounding counties. But then the drop in home ownership has been significant. Remember, this was a place where a significant number of Black people used to own their homes, over 60%. Now it's well under 50%. And so those are the things that jump out for me.
So spot on it. And I want this to be a conversation. So if other panelists want to jump in on certain topics, feel free to do so. But Dr. Prince, to unpack a bit more about that gentrification piece and how that has played a role in the history of Chocolate City, you're a native Washingtonian. You are born and bred DC. You've seen Black families pushed out of DC and end up in places like PG County. Folks now call PG County the new Chocolate City. From your experience and your lived experience, the work that you do in your research, what impacts have gentrification kind of played in from that historic piece standpoint, but also as it relates to some of the work that you're doing in your lived experience?
Oh gosh, well, thanks for asking. Thanks for having us all to engage in this dialogue. History is so important. I mean, it's important in a general sense. It's important to understand what was there. And it's also important to understand the legacy of that. In terms of my own family, I've been blessed to learn this history. It's not stuff that folks pass down. Sometimes people don't want to talk about their past. When I was writing my second book, I was blessed to be able to gather the oral histories of my own family to understand for the first time how my own family was intertwined in this history. All my grandparents were born in 1899, all four of them. My maternal grandfather came here when he was 16, and where did he go? Right to Georgetown. That's where his extended kin were. And he lived with them. So, unknowing how we're, overlapping with this. And I guess one of the key takeaways there, it's personal, it's somewhat anecdotal, but it extends to a larger population, and that is the vulnerability, right? The fact that my grandfather, God bless him, 4 children, 3 of his daughters educated. They had about a 4th grade education. They were agrarian workers coming out of the South. They came here to DC just so intricately tied to the development of this city, but they experienced a lot of discrimination, right? And the areas where they were living in Georgetown were ultimately, they were moved out of there. A lot of that was demolished. A lot of the places where even where my mom lived, going back to see that they were demolished. What I take from that is there was less concern about the people, more concerned about the property, right? The property that they were occupying, wanting to get that from them, right? The strategic location of places plays a big role in gentrification. So my family were just moved from place to place. They were not given extra resources. They weren't helped along the way. They were affected by redlining, and all these things. So history has a legacy. It also has a way of repeating itself. And for me, one of the things I really take from that is that whatever solutions that we have, that we develop, need to be embedded, they need to be reflective of that history, and they need to reflect the reality, and they need to be direct and intentional rather than trickle down. So, the legacy of the history is powerful of people persevering, but it's also a history of unfairness. And so we have to address all that and attend to all that as we move forward thinking about solutions.
Yeah, it was so much substance in what you said, and I think there's a lot we can unpack there, especially as like I think as we talk about like how some of the policies have shaped the role of gentrification and the future of Chocolate City. I think of people like my mom, for example. I grew up born and raised Southeast. She did as well. She isn't no longer a DC resident. She got pushed out and moved out to a small town in Virginia, not because she wanted to, but primarily she had 5 kids and couldn't afford to live here anymore. Right. At some point, for her, it was okay. All of my kids are off to college. I still need to put some food and things on the table as far as housing. But the homeowner rates are going down, but also the affordability and what we think is affordable in DC is no longer affordable for someone who's a school teacher, right? So that's a way gentrification has impacted my life, because I was forced to come home after college where my mom didn't live here anymore, and I had to sleep on my grandmother's nursing home couch or go to my mentor's house to stay there. But that's not just unique to like this young Black male or myself. That's many young Black males across the city, young Black families across the city who are, or Black families across the city who are experiencing that. Mignote, you're a superstar, and you're making a film right now to focus in on some young Black males east of the river, and talking about some of those lived experiences. What are some of the things you are highlighting with that film, and like the role that gentrification, but also the future Chocolate City plays in your film that you're developing?
Thank you so much. And thank you. This film is definitely the community coming together behind me to help put this all together. So I want to really, really thank everyone who's been a part of the journey. And of course, there's a siren coming right as I unmute myself. But so yeah, what happened in Chocolate City really follows 3 working class Washingtonians from 3 generations. And one thing that I found really important in developing this film was, how can I talk about what's happened in the past 20 years without addressing really what's happened, I think, over the past century and plus, right? Of course, the film doesn't go that far back, but we start really with, yes, we focus on the younger generation, which is extremely important, but we start with John Russell, who's now a 77-year-old man in Southeast DC, kind of born and raised all throughout the city, and bring it down to what we see today. When we look at displacement today, it is so heavily tied to everything that happened in the previous decades. And so in talking about, I'll address Zarina, who I believe you're referring to when you're talking about the youth in Southeast. Zarina is now a 15-year-old girl who, when I started working with her, was 11 years old and was highly aware and hypercritical of the development happening in the city. And there's a line in the film, when, if you guys see next week, where she says, "I don't think I'm going to believe it, but I have to hope." No. And I think for an 11-year-old to have that statement is so indicative of the environment that she's in, is so indicative of a city, of a government not supporting the youth, or only supporting particular residents in this city. I myself am a transplant. I moved here in 2010, right when the population was drastically shifting below 50%. And one thing that was really appealing to me was, I grew up outside of LA in a predominantly white neighborhood and wanted to move to a chocolate city. There was always an appeal to that, and experience once I came here this dichotomy of, I can navigate the city very uniquely as a Black transplant, benefit from the gentrification, benefit from the new infrastructure, but also be aware of what's going on. And so that's really what sparked the discussion of what happened to Chocolate City and how can we explore this in a way that's not just, academic text, but really tells the real life stories of Washingtonians and is accessible to the community.
Yeah, and I think I hate to say this, but I'm going to say that it's sometimes we your own people too, right? In the role that they've played in leadership, like Black leadership in this city, have played a tremendous role in gentrification and the demographic shifts, and people not being able to continue to own homes, and how it's been tough for Black-owned businesses, even doing right now in the COVID-19. The power shift of the city have certainly changed from the 18th centuries when we were under control, about a federal government to the 19th centuries where we're under control. We're still under control, but as our leadership became more focused on self-governance, and there were leaders in the city that played a role, how some of those policies have impacted what the city looks like today. Dr. Imam, your work and your and the studies and scholarships that you've been focused on talks about some of those policies, and Dr. Perry also knows some of the policies that you focus on within your work. Highlight how some of those policies have played a role in the future, but also the now chocolate city. But just to kick it off with Dr. Imam, can you talk about how some of those policies in which they shape the future of the district and where we are now?
Sure, and thank you for this conversation. It's really a pleasure to be in such great company among scholars whose work I really respect. I want to go back to the point about history, because I think we tend to think about the contemporary forces of gentrification as unique and as a first for the district. But really, when you think about the history that Sabia has described and her grandparents being forced out of Georgetown in the early 1900s, that was a wave of gentrification across the city. We've also had waves of slum clearance, urban renewal, redlining. We have had highway clearance. We have had white flight and steering that have really fragmented and segregated the city in the form that we know it today. And those underlying forces that have shaped the patterns of residential, racial segregation, class segregation across the city are really some of the underlying forces that set in place the kinds of possibilities that we have for the city today, as well as just the basic underlying forces that create the kind of vulnerabilities that she mentioned. So I think we shouldn't think about gentrification in the chocolate city as just a current phenomenon. We should see it in different waves and different trajectories, in the kind of serial displacement, Jamal, that you referred to as a native Washingtonian, that this is not just a current phase that people are being pushed out today. People have been pushed out and made more vulnerable over several decades in the city. And they've also, as Sabia has said, have been really resilient. And part of that resilience has put in place some of the protections that we rely on today in terms of affordable housing policies. Part of the tenant revolts of the 1970s gave us rent control in the district, right? This was also under the era of Black-led leadership in the city, the first time that the DC had its own mayor and Black city council that was able to pass some really progressive tenant laws and tenant protections, some of the strongest in the nation that we still rely on. The Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which allows tenants to organize and purchase their own buildings that are being sold. Those are still the same protections that are allowing tenants to organize and purchase their buildings today. And those are the kind of protections that need to be reinforced, because we're seeing that some of those protections aren't working very well, right? Tenant rent control, when it was passed, was great and progressive at the time, but it's simply not working that well today. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act was great when it was first passed, but it's simply not working very well today. So what we need is actually to re-envision and reimagine many of the organizing and many of the policies that we passed decades ago. And importantly, in a time period where the pressures were not as strong as they are today. So many of the things that we were able to pass were during periods of time where where gentrification was not at its peak as it was today. So we have to sort of think about these waves of gentrification as creating different opportunities. And it's difficult to craft new policy during the times when the quote unquote market, which I think we should talk about, is as strong as it is today.
You know, I wanted to just add on to that, and I'll talk a little bit of some more recent history, but in general, the speakers are absolutely correct. There's always been an assault on Black communities. I mean, particularly, we've had education, Supreme Court cases, we've had housing cases. I mean, Black communities have always been under assault. But I just want to point to a larger philosophy that's not only affected DC, but other Black majority cities around the country. Remember, municipalities, for the most part, are still the largest landowners in cities. And the way that many of them are, or many mayors are, and city councils are trying to excite the economy is to develop land by selling it off to developers at a low price in exchange for development and new activities. But under all of that is this philosophical belief that you need new people to come in your city. And by the way, you don't have to do that. I just want to be clear. You don't, there is another belief in that you can invest in the people who are there. And that's what's been missing, because when you're talking about, particularly around that time when Anthony Williams was in place, that's when we started to see this push to bring in people into the city and it was an assumption that we need new leadership, we need new people, we need new residents. And it was in many ways a backhanded blaming of the Black people for for the city not developing, when in fact it's always been a lack of investment that caused the lack of development. I am a child who grew up in the 80s. You will never hear me talk about or say that the 80s wasn't a rough patch. The 90s wasn't a rough patch for Black people everywhere. And in particular, the DC area was ravaged by the crack cocaine epidemic in a lot of ways. But I just want to be clear what caused that. It was a lack of investment in education, a lack of investment in housing, a lack of job opportunities. All of those things heighten the impact of drug use in our countries. And then when the home prices lowered, people saw the value of homes, saw the value of land, and they invested in those developments in ways that pushed us out. And so we need to go back to a strategy of how do you invest in people who live here? And that includes direct payments for home ownership, down payment assistance, tax credits for folks who are living here, business investments. Shout out to Councilman McDuffie for doing a lot in these areas. But the same way we attracted others to come here, we can attract or we can keep people here by investing in them. So I just wanted to make sure we address the sort of that philosophical approach to economic development that harms Black people.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I think there's an ideology that African-American people are not for development, right? That's some of the pushback. And it's like, there's so many issues there. We really need to listen to people. That's one thing. Let's not make up scenarios about folks. Folks want development of all different sorts. We need to be clear that there is this thing called uneven development, where some people, we have social hierarchies. So we need to, understand that and see that. So if you're providing, I'm going to sound redundant because I've said this before, but if you're providing tanning salons in a community that doesn't need that, that's not an asset. That's not an improvement, right? So, the whole new communities initiative, you know, we already have communities. So we need to enhance the communities that we have and the resources that we have. And this idea that Black people are not for development is just completely false. They
Right.
want to be at the table. They want to be included. And community-based organizations are fighting for community-based development. That is understanding the social hierarchies and that people have different needs. And so, and thank you, Willow, for laying out all those policies that are there that need to be enhanced or that need to be enforced. Some of this stuff is voluntary, inclusionary zoning, that's voluntary. There's so many things that are, you know, optional. But, you know, we need to, again, have intentionality. That's so
Yeah.
important.
No, I echo that, and I think even greater, it's not even greater. You all mentioned this. Like for me, it's again like Black people aren't against development, like you said, Dr. Prince. But as the problem that comes is that those Black people who lived here for generations and lived here for years, we're all for prosperity. But if we can experience that prosperity, then it's not for us, and that means not just we're not opposed to nice new things in our communities, but what we are opposed to is putting nice new things in our community, but not giving people the opportunity to experience nice new jobs, right? It's like you can expect to put a Starbucks in the Black community, but however, at the same token, that same community has the highest rate for unemployment rates, right? So like there's an imbalance that exists when it comes to city services and how we're providing for Black communities that we have to address. And if we aren't, the same people that's been here for generations, if they're not being able to experience that prosperity, they'll be pushed out from that prosperity. And there's many communities like that across the district. Ward 5 is a community in the district that I think is that proves that. You got places like U Street, but you also got communities like Brooklyn, right? Is that you can't put up you can't take over a public housing development, redevelop it and promise all of those residents that they can come back. But in the same vein, you have a policy that says you can't have anyone who was formerly incarcerated or have a felony on their records. They can't come back and live in this in this new building. But however, if you were in the public housing before, you can come back. That one policy literally automatically eliminates the majority of those families who live with people who have former felon records, right? And that's just based on the data. So again, like the policy has to reflect that.
But I want to just add something else to this, that we have assets in DC that is constantly devalued and ignored. I mean, the PCS Metro fiasco that led to the Don't Mute DC protests. It was an amazing story of a store owner that's been there for 20 years, meaning, and for those who don't know the store, it essentially plays go-go music outside of it. It's near Howard University in the Shaw neighborhood. If folks aren't familiar with that area, historically a majority Black area, it's quickly gentrified. No longer is it majority Black. There's development right across the street called the Chi, largely populated with mostly white people who started to complain about the Metro PCS store playing Black music, right? Now, what's wrong-headed about that, you have an asset. That business could not exist if it for 20 something years if it wasn't a strong asset. Why would you attack an asset that is bringing economic activity to an area? Is really an act of cutting your nose to spite your face. So I say that to say, even we should not assume that the Black businesses and organizations in DC were or having had bad service, or they weren't a good business. No, our assets are overlooked, devalued, and attacked because there's a perspective that if you want a prosperous city, it needs to be whiter. And that is really driving so much of the push out. It's not just being priced out. Let's be clear about that. It's about, we don't want Black people to be the anchor of economic growth because it doesn't look right.
Yep.
And so for me, we need to incorporate that in our analysis, because I can tell you time and time again of businesses that they were essentially like in the Metro PCS example, the owner the police was called on him, and Black businesses, Black institutions are treated like Black people. So they get police called on them, they get fire department called on them until they are essentially pushed out. So I just wanted to say that we have assets in Black communities that are strong, that are profitable, but they are being attacked nonetheless.
I think that you raise a huge point about the arts and the culture in DC, right? And arts and culture has, and Miyote, I want to swing this one over to you. Arts and culture has been a staple piece of showcasing district culture, but it also has got young people in the city to rise up and start talking about what we're talking about now, but through a specific way. Like I think that T-Mobile instance was the fuel to the fire for movements like Don't Mute DC and like Long Live Go-Go, to really showcase DC culture, and doing that in the hub of DC. Miyote, can you, as a young person, I'm young myself and I can answer this question as well, but as a young person, how have you seen the shift over the last 5 years from the Don't Mute DC movement to Long Live Go-Go, and how have young people have been like starting these conversations and been like using arts to express their form of culture and arts in DC?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's extremely interesting in this city where art has been politicized heavily, and the type of art that gets funding and support in this city correlates directly with the message they want, right? You're not going to have Black muralists in DC that are talking truthfully about what's happening in the city get funded to get their work up. What happened in Chocolate City applied to 1 million local grants and did not get a single thing because it was asking questions they didn't want funded, right? Or they didn't want answered publicly. And so I think with Don't Mute DC, Natalie Hopkinson, one of the co-founders, along with Ron Moten, is in What Happened in Chocolate City. And in her book, she speaks heavily to the politicization of go-go music and when local politicians want to be in support of it and against it. And I think it's very interesting and maybe controversial to bring up again now, but you see so much public display of support now for go-go and this fight to not mute this city, but have the policies that are actually muting the people shifted, right? And that's one of the reasons why we opened production back up too. Is there's so many acts of performative acts in the city, right? And we see it with Black Lives Matter Plaza being painted, but Black artists in the city not necessarily being supported. And so I think there's a large voice now. We have Dee Dwyers, who's an amazing photographer based out of Congress Heights, whose work really highlights the community and really highlights what's going on and authentically tells it. There's so many powerful Black artists, and DC is such an artistic community dating all the way back. But what I think is really interesting is, and we have now put this into the film, is this idea of the creative economy and the creative class and who makes up that, right? In Anthony Williams' plan to bring 100,000 new residents to the district, he wasn't talking about bringing 100,000 new Black residents to the district. He was talking about bringing white residents. If you want to talk about diversity, the age range that he was trying to bring, when we look at the creative class, you're looking at an age range of 18 to 34. You're looking at millennials, bringing them in that will live in these PUDs, that will live in these communities without having an understanding of the history of the community they're living in. It's essentially a pit stop for their career and don't necessarily have a long tie to their city. And so it allows for this shift. And I think through that, you're seeing the arts being used locally to kind of, express what's going on in the community. I think it's really interesting. One thing that I came across, and I'll wrap this up, in working with the youth and working with particularly high school students and high school and middle school students, is there's not necessarily an affiliation or tie to go-go music within that age range. And you can tie that directly to music being pulled out of DC public school in a lot of the schools. When I spoke to many of the go-go band members from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, they all learned how to play instruments in the public school. And so when you have this shift in public school, in public education, when you have a shift in investment in the community, that's going to be reflected in the art that's produced and the shift of culture that's happening in the city.
So spot on. Willow, I want to get you in on this conversation too. And there's some questions in the chat that we'll mix in throughout the conversation, but I want to toss this question over to you. What has been the impact of Black mayors like Williams, Fincy, Gray, and now Bowser? You don't have to necessarily touch on any particular mayor or talk up or down about any particular mayor, but you study this work. So just to swing this one over to you, what has been the impact of some of those Black mayors in the future of Chocolate City?
Well, I mean, I think that the Black mayors historically in the city have had a really powerful influence on Black employment, around changing the culture of policing in the city. I mean, if you think about Marion Barry, who love or hate Marion Barry, what reshaped, and led Chocolate City during a very important period, right? This is after the killings of Martin Luther King, the uprisings in DC. We get home rule for the first time, and we have a Black Power mayor that came out of the Black Power movement, right? That worked with SNCC, that started Pride DC to employ underemployed and unemployed young Black men in the city, who changed the police force such that more Black officers had to live in the city, right? Change some of our development culture such that, that more Black and brown contractors are being employed by the city, and started the youth summer program, which my son will be doing this year, right? So this is a legacy of the city. And so there's a lot of great things that have happened under Black leadership in the city. But as Andre pointed out, I mean, there's a continual lack of investment in the city, right? So what, happened under the Barry administration was, really struggling with a lack of funding across the city. You have white flight out of the city, you have major businesses, the downtown of DC evaporates, right? And there's no anchors to economic development in the city any longer. And so, you're really struggling with how to pay pensions across the city for teachers and all of these things that is leading to the era of Anthony Williams, where the city is literally almost bankrupt, right? And then Anthony Williams comes in with a plan to revitalize the city with neoliberal policies and bring 100,000 people in. But you have to sort of understand that he was dealing with a set of financial constraints that were from a lack of investment in the city and really from the flight of capital outside of the city. So I think that's an important context, not to say that Anthony Williams didn't do a lot of damage to the city, but the lack of constraint, the amount of constraints on the tax base in DC was real during that period, right? Home ownership was leaving, even the Black middle class was leaving the city and taking some of that tax base with it. And then you have mayors like Fenty that comes in and makes the schools sort of a pillar of their platform to, sort of continue the policies of Williams in terms of bringing back, right? Why are we, again, bringing back people to the city and not investing in the people that are here, but, this real push towards the schools, not necessarily to serve the residents that are here, but to attract residents back. And now, we've had Gray and now Bowser, who have really mixed records in this regard in terms of, what is economic development? What is the vision for economic development? What is the vision for prosperity in the city? And how do policies around affordable housing and economic development really fit into this vision. I mean, there's some good things that have happened under the Bowser administration with $100,000 in however many much in affordable housing trust funds, with trying to spread homeless shelters around the city, with trying to spread affordable housing around the city. But there's been a lot of losses too, right? There's been a lot of huge development projects that have been done on public land, as Andre was saying, that is not creating, that is not balanced by a need to create more affordable housing in the city. There's been a lot of opportunities that have been lost to strengthen existing policies, as well as build new policies like inclusionary zoning, which could be a strong tool if it was better funded and if it actually worked well to produce new housing in the city. So I think we have a lot of mixed records across our different mayors and across the different leaderships, but I think there's also been an extreme set of constraints upon the leadership in DC.
There's so much to unpack there. And before we jump into Q&A, I know we got a few more minutes left. And Dr. Prince, I want to get you tied into some of this conversation around disenfranchisement, but also how the power shift of DC has played a role over the years, right? Where at one point where DC was majority white, there was a less hands-on approach to how DC governed themselves. But as the city became more and more Black, the federal government took more and more measures to put more control on DC residents, right? The history of DC's disenfranchisement is tied to racism and subjugation. DC residents have lacked representation in Congress since the passage of the Organic Act in 1801, which placed the district under congressional control and stripped their representation in Congress. So Black residents took representation in Congress from those residents. And then the moment for DC electoral representation first gained real traction during the Civil Rights Movement. At that time, DC was about 65% white and fairly even split in terms of party, which gave both parties an incentive to enfranchise its residents, which then the federal government handed back some control over to DC residents to take control of their city. But enfranchisement kind of stopped around the 1970s, and over 70% of DC was Black. And this proves that disenfranchisement of DC residents is clear racism in an effort to minimize Black political power. Dr. Prince, you've got to experience some of this Black political power from Marion Barry to Mayor Bowser right now. But can you talk about the role in which statehood plays a major key proponent in representation for Black people, but also in helping moving like Chocolate City forward?
Sure. I mean, I think statehood is very important. I have a statehood sign in front of my house right now. If we had statehood, perhaps there's so many things that could be improved. I mean, I'm thinking about January 6th, if we had a governor, you know what I'm saying? I mean, we would have actual representation. But if I do want to kind of circle back, if you don't mind, to that culture question, because It's something I wanted to share there, because far too often, I think when we talk culture, the conversation shifts to expressive culture or performative culture. And, what I found that there's so many aspects of African-American culture that are made vulnerable by gentrification, including our communal way of life and our extended family way of life, which I think are super valuable. And this really relates to this conversation about displacement being voluntary, which was something that I think Mayor Bowser and some other folks have kind of gotten behind, that way of kind of minimizing the impact of gentrification by arguing that people have left voluntarily. And I really want to revisit this concept of vulnerability. I think both the first out-migration wave during the 60s, after the uprisings, I took oral histories from people. And what I learned was that people were saying that they didn't feel safe. They didn't feel that the police were responding to them when they had challenges. And of course, they wanted a better bang for their buck. So they were able to get larger homes, larger backyards, more affordably in Prince George's County. But even with this contemporary sort of out-migration going on now, we see people seeing their social networks being undermined, right? When you see your community just being dispersed outwards, out into other parts of the city, out to Maryland, that makes people vulnerable. That puts people in a spot, and it's not just hanging out with your friends. I was collecting the oral history once of an older Black woman in Mount Pleasant. A teenager came in and said, "Hey, Miss So-and-so, I'm going to run to the store. Can I get you a loaf of bread?" There are examples of people being displaced from Arthur Caper Carrollsburg when that was demolished, and people losing their networks. One woman was deceased in her unit for weeks because there was no one in her community that she knew. Her son was incarcerated. So, people are a resource and people matter. And their culture matters in so many ways outside of music and dance. And those are important too. But our way of life is cultural too, right? When you undermine that, you're helping to push this displacement because you're making people having to spend more money for resources, not having ways to take care of their health, having more difficulty getting to the doctor, getting to the store. Churches leaving, institutions, businesses that you rely on that are culturally significant, providing the food that you want, being replaced by something that is completely unfamiliar to you. So, I think just more, criticism, a little more critical look at this notion of people leaving voluntarily and really kind of broadening our view of culture and how culture is so negatively affected by gentrification. And yes, politicians are very much a part of that scenario since gentrification is policy oriented. Right?
Willow, I'll get you in and then we'll jump to Q&A. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Sabia is saying here. Not only questioning sort of the notion of voluntarily, residents voluntarily leaving, but also thinking about, the impacts of displacement and where people are moving to, and the kind of vulnerabilities that they face in that situation, in that new location, right? So a lot of people are leaving the DC region altogether. I used to live in, near Howard University, and many of my neighbors in the early 2000s left and went to North and South Carolina, right? So it is part of this Black migration back to the South in terms of expensive cities that people can no longer live. So it's not just leaving into Prince George's County or into, even ex-urban parts of the region where people are spending a lot more to be able to get to jobs inside of DC or around the Beltway because they've been so far displaced to Frederick, to Prince Williams County, to Herndon, right? And so far outside of the region, that's almost not even part of the region anymore, right? But also the kind of, the lack of social services, the lack of community-based organizations in those places, the lack of a social network, the lack of affordable housing protections, right? So we talked about how a lot of these affordable housing protections were built in a time of organizing in the city that hasn't happened in the kind of places that people are just being displaced to, right? So we think, and we need to think about, the impacts both that are happening inside of DC, which is even, pushing people further into Northeast and Southeast. The concentrated poverty levels in those areas have gotten much worse over the last several decades, but also what is happening to people outside of the district. And we really don't have, coordinated policies across our 3 states and our many counties in which we live to actually be able to handle the kind of conditions that people are facing. So it's much less expensive and it's much better for people to stay in place and for us to figure out the policies that allow them to do that.
Thank you for that. Let's jump over to Q&A, and Andre, I want you to jump in first on this question. As you're thinking through that playlist that I'm still waiting for, go. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat about preservation of DC and its culture. Question, what can we do to begin to support and maintain the historical culture of Chocolate City?
Well, it's that prior conversation we just had around cultural institutions and people who produce culture. They also do so through their businesses. It's not just go-go music. It's a go-go band that's actually a business. And so and one of the steps we need to make sure is, particularly during this, and we saw this during the PPP loan fiasco, that so many businesses were getting relief, but they ignored many of the cultural businesses. And so some of this is just good old fashioned, just invest in Black businesses that happen to be in the cultural arena. But there's a power with arts and culture that's a little bit different than selling phones. I mean, when the power of culture has the ability to transform norms, social norms, as well as generate revenue for businesses. So one of the things I just say, we need to invest in small businesses, including those that produce this culture. And it goes without saying, and the reason why I put so much emphasis on housing is because it's clear, DC, they want Black people's labor. It's not like people aren't working in DC. They want our labor. They even want our the affectations of culture, a mural here, this and that. But do they want us to live here? That's a different story.
Wow.
And so you need to focus on ways to create home ownership programs and business programs, because as was stated, if you invest in place, in brick and mortar, that essentially just raises property values and people are pushed out. The way to combat that is to invest in people, directly in people, low interest business loans, low interest housing loans, those kind of things. Put the money in the capital in people's pockets. They own, people then aren't worried about push out. When you have a significant percentage of Black folk owning their property, owning their business, people aren't complaining then. As Sabia noted, we're not against development. We want development. But we need investment for those developments to make sense. So those are just some ideas to that question.
We got about three minutes left before we wrap up and give some closing statements. There was a question about reparations, and I think that's always an interesting question, because a part of that for me is that it's not just that we're asking for payback, but we're also asking for investments and equitable investments. Like, you can't just give someone a check but not follow up by giving them a job. It's like a band-aid to the larger problem. So I'm gonna still frame the question though. How, and feel free anyone to jump in on this one. How might reparations inform how DC repairs the harms inflicted on BIPOC communities, both historically and currently, current inequities economically and socially?
Well, I mean, reparations means to repair, right? So who could possibly be against that? I mean, the historical record shows all the damage. And I know, Dr. Perry, I remember citing your study that you did with a number of other people with the $156 billion figure of the devaluation of assets for African Americans. So that's an unfairness that needs to be addressed. I mean, and then, we don't need to talk about enslavement. Well, I mean, we do need to, but just in terms of, that's a whole other set of reparations. So reparations is the only moral thing that needs to happen, however you want to frame it. I mean, there's so many policies. I'm looking around the country at Evanston, Illinois. They're doing some experimental stuff that's been very successful. Stockton, California is doing basic income stuff that has been very effective. This is all experimental, temporary, fixes. They're not anything that is permanently changing the structure. And that's where that conversation needs to go, right? Frequently in DC, we have experimental solutions and we have solutions that are not sustained. So I can't talk specifics about policies or reparations. It's not just about money. I know a check is the first thing that people think about, but it's so many other things. And yes, a check is great as well. But there are a lot of people who've made this their life's work to, understand and analyze this. I'm firmly an advocate for reparations. It's just another way of framing these myriad policy interventions that need to take place. There are micro level and there are macro level interventions that need to occur.
But I want to be clear, everybody actually believes in reparations, everybody. Just look at after a few weeks of being socially distant, you saw white businesses going, owners going, we need relief from the federal government. We need a response. They got their response. Now, what does repair look like for people who've been socially distanced for generations? Tell me what that PPP loan package looks like, that CARES Act package. So when people talk about reparations and it's a controversial issue, it's only about reparations for Black people that's controversial for them.
Yep.
Because when it comes to suffering, oh, we don't allow for white suffering for the most part. We find the money. We talked about inflation. That inflation hasn't come after really 2 major stimulus bills that people warned it. We haven't seen inflation. Yep. And so for me, let's be clear. The only time reparations becomes a problem is when you're talking about Black people, because we provide reparations in principle all the time.
I think a perfect example of that is the response to the Black farmers and what Biden has done for the Black farmers. It's a perfect example of that right there. And white farmers got how many billion? Black farmers got something, and the world has suddenly come to an end.
Yeah. And I'll also add in terms of thinking about what reparations has historically looked like, suburbanization is the perfect example of white reparations, right? I mean, when affirmative action was white is when the government was helping to subsidize home loans for white people, and Black people couldn't get access to those funds, right? And even after the 1968 Fair Housing Act, we saw that just changed into predatory, what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has called predatory inclusion, right? So you're getting housing opportunities, but it's in predatory terms such that it's putting you more at risk rather than giving you opportunity. And so now when we're talking about like Evanston, Illinois, what are they actually proposing? They're proposing homeowners loans for Black people that have been historically redlined. So first of all, who is that leaving aside, right? It's not including everybody, right? And it's not towards these kind of solutions that Andre is talking about, which are people-based solutions that say, you can actually handle your own money. It doesn't have to go to the government and to the banks who historically redlined you. Actually, you can get some relief that can be used, and you can be trusted to use these funds in ways that can actually help to create opportunity for you. And I think we just don't have frameworks for even thinking along these lines in terms of policies. I mean, I think we're really just in the early phases of kind of thinking what it looks like policies, but I think we have to get our principles right to really be able to think about what policy looks like, because I think the policies that are coming down are oftentimes using the frames of reparations, but not including the people who have been injured at the table to craft those policies in ways that actually work for people.
That's mandatory.
We got about a minute or two left. Miyote, did you want to add anything to that? So let's find with that.
I think everybody covered it. I don't really have anything additional to that. This has just been a great opportunity to hear from everyone and to share a little bit about the film as well. Thank you.
So before we close out, I want to give everybody a final shot to say thank you to the audience, but to set off a charge. So we're going to go in a quick order and just really recap the discussion, but in a way where you want folks in the audience to take something away. So what's your charge to the audience? What do you want them to take away from this discussion? And I'll kick it off first with Andre Perry.
All right. You hear that Chuck Brown, baby? You hear that Chuck baby playing? See, you got to get the mood right. We should have played that in the beginning to set the mood right. But, I always say that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. That oftentimes when you're talking about the quote unquote problems of DC, The problems are not in the people, it's in the policy. And if we really want to develop DC in a way that helps people, we'll start by removing the extractive policies that hurt us. So I'll just leave it there, because there's a whole different philosophy that we have not just taken, but it requires believing in Black people in order to do it.
Nyote?
I guess, the main thing that I'll just say is to really understand and think critically about, whether if you're a student that's living here, if you're a transplant, if you're native, to think critically about how the foundation of everything is housing and stability. And so when we think about, when we think about policy, when we think about how we want to move forward in all these other ways, this during COVID, the racial riots in the beginning of COVID, it was so easy for people to get behind very visible displays of racism. But housing historically has always been, housing policy has always been racist in this country. And so when we think about really just as simple as the psychological effect, the public health effect, all of those things, the root is housing. And so I'm not an expert in housing. I'm not a policymaker. I'm not, an academic. I'm a filmmaker. And for me, it was a question that I had that I wanted to answer. And so people are out there, the resources are out there. Get behind organizing nonprofits here, get behind the community-based organizations here, and be a citizen in this city. Don't just be a transplant, don't just be a resident, be active and trust and know and listen to the Black Washingtonians that have been here for so long, because their stories matter and their stories have a lot of the solutions that we're looking for.
Thank you. Willow.
So much has already been said. I would just say, just remember that this is the first and largest chocolate city. There is value in that. There has been so much that has come out of this city in terms of Black leadership, in terms of Black culture, in terms of, Black opportunity, in terms of Black employment. And we have to think about what is being lost in this moment. And as Minyote said, we have to trust the people that have been here for generations to help us find solutions that really center them, their voices, and their aspirations. And that takes a level of leadership that we've not yet to see, but is possible.
Pia?
Yes, I guess I would say, murals are not people. So save the people, save the culture. And I guess I want to push for collective action. That would be my departing words. I feel when people act collectively, they have more power. When they speak with one voice, they have more power than one individual. So I know that people are under a lot of pressure. It's very difficult to work all day and then come home and meet and organize and do things with folks. And maybe there needs to be subsidizing for people to be able to do that work, because it's hard, but I really believe that. I'm a big believer in organizing. So, Kwame Ture said, organize, organize, organize. And I believe that.
Awesome. I'm just going to close out and say support DC statehood and make sure that you're empowering people across America to talk about the importance of giving representation to Black and brown citizens or American citizens that are still treated like second-class citizens. So in the short, simple, and sweet, DC statehood. Thank you all for tuning in. I was going to say tonight, but it's 1 p.m., but it felt like we had this discussion for so long. But continue to connect with us and visit the website to see more about who we are individually and connect with us offline if you have any further questions or topics you want to discuss. But I'll hand it back over to the NYU team to close us out. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in. And then tune into next week, Minyote's film viewing next week at 7 p.m. On Tuesday. So looking forward to that.